Welcome. I am talking today about moving from small-scale testing to wide-scale implementation and sustainability. The agenda for today is I'm going to share the origins of some of the literature on sustainable improvement, and then I'll share some research-based strategies for successful implementation and sustainability. We will have time to discuss implications for summer research immersions. We chose this as something to really hang this literature on and apply it to something that you're doing. And then we'll end with a time for questions, answers, and figure out next steps. My objective is to help all of you increase your awareness and understanding of strategies for sustainability, and to walk away with concrete strategies that will facilitate the scale up of the summer research immersions and to identify next steps in your work. I will begin with the origins of the research base that I'll be discussing. This word cloud has a bunch of different disciplines listed. You should be familiar with improvement science, because that's where networked improvement communities come from and the Carnegie work. But there are some other terms here that are all related disciplines. And I'll give you a moment to just kind of take that in. Maybe you've heard of some of these. Maybe you've dabbled in some of these. All of those disciplines basically came from the work of W. Edwards Deming in the 1940s and 1950s. That work originated in industry, and you may be familiar with some of the models that came out of Japanese manufacturing, like Toyota is really known for adopting these kinds of principles to create lasting change. So he proposed or created a system of profound knowledge that has 4 elements. The first is appreciating a system. That's acknowledging that change doesn't happen in a vacuum when we're dealing with complex organizations and people. And then the second is understanding variation, understanding why when you implement a change, why is it not implemented uniformly? What are the causes for that variation? And oftentimes we're focused on, when we're trying to reach certain outcomes, we're trying to minimize that variation. The third element is group psychology, recognizing that we're dealing with human interactions, how humans communicate and relate to one another. And then finally, understanding the importance of a theory of knowledge. So as you are promoting and implementing change, it's grounded in theory about why you think that change is going to produce the outcomes that you hope to achieve. The goal of all of these disciplines is a focus on constant improvement, to promote consistent high-quality behavior by people and by organizations, to successfully put a process in place to implement change, to use an intentional and disciplined approach to change, and ultimately, the goal is to create sustainable improvement to achieve meaningful outcomes. And there's a shorthand description of your first 2 goal, that you want to double the rate of STEM graduates. So as you know, improvement work happens in various stages, and first 2 is well on its way through some of these stages. You began with a root cause analysis where you were trying to really understand the problem that you were trying to address. And through that work, you may remember, you did something called a fishbone diagram. Many of you were involved in that. And then you went on to identifying solutions. And that's where you identified drivers and change ideas using a driver diagram. And all 4 of your working groups have wonderful driver diagrams where you have articulated the changes that you want to see happen to produce the outcomes that you want. Then you moved on to small scale tests of change through PDSA cycles, and you've been doing that for a while. What I'm talking about today is this last stage, which really has multiple stages within it. But what I'm talking about today is once you have identified a promising or evidence-based practice that you want to implement, you've decided, okay, we're seeing some success, it's showing promise. Now, how do you take that practice and implement it fully and scale it up so that you can achieve outcomes on a broader scale? So that's really what today's about. By the way, I didn't mention, you are free to interrupt me at any time if you have a question. If we start getting too distracted, I might ask for questions to be held, but please do feel free. I wanted to go back to that systems lens to change. So here I put together different layers of the systems within that you are working in. So the high level is your state agencies and federal agencies, such as the NSF Includes initiative. And each of these agencies has the potential, or each of these levels has the potential to influence the other levels. And so a systems approach acknowledges that. So then you have your first two network made up of multiple institutions within your state. Then you have the individual institutions and organizations. Within those organizations, you have departments, you may have committees, task force, some sort of subgroup. And then you have the individual people who are implementing the practices. And then I ran out of space, but of course you've got the people that, whose outcomes you're trying to change, the rural first generation students. I wanted to draw your attention, especially today, to this institutional level. In first two, you've done a lot of work at the network level, and a lot of what I'm talking about today is focused on the institutional level. Because if you want to see lasting change beyond the NSF grant that you have, the grant's going to end in a few years. If you want these changes to last, you really need to focus on building that capacity of your institutions. And here's one of them. I went and got Marshall's little emblem there. So this is one institution, Marshall University. You want this institution, as well as the other ones that are part of your network, to institutionalize change so that these practices like summer research immersions are part of normal operating procedures. The resources, the structure, and staff are just all there, and it's just part of what Marshall University does, and it's part of what the other universities and the other organizations that are involved. And so that is the goal. Eventually, I mean, you've got time, but this is what I'm really hoping we'll start thinking about going forward. I'm just going to stop for a second to see if there's any big questions or comments. Okay. So now I want to talk about some of those strategies. And I have a lot to talk about. We will have other opportunities to delve into some of these more, but I'm really just trying to give you an overview from the research. And I want to start by telling you that I have relied heavily on one main resource, and that is the National Implementation Research Network. I'm going to use the acronym NIRN a little bit later when I'm citing some of their work. They are proponents or embrace implementation science, which is one of those disciplines that was on the word cloud. Their focus is on education and social services, as opposed to like healthcare, which has its own organization that works on improvement. And so they operate from two basic assumptions. The first is we have evidence-based practices. There are solutions to some of the problems that our society and our education systems have. The problem is the second bullet is that we need evidence-based implementation of those practices to see sustained practice that really do achieve those meaningful results across large, groups of people. And then also I'm drawing from research on the sustainability of innovations. All those disciplines, going back to the 1940s, there's been a lot of research on organizations and how to sustain innovations. And I just want to comment, I'm going to use the term innovation, I'm going to use the term intervention, I'm going to use the term programs and practices, but all of these are things like the summer research immersion. It's a program or a practice that you have decided to implement to achieve the desired outcome. So I'm just telling you that I'm using these terms interchangeably. This figure comes from NERN, and this is their formula for success, and it shows 3 key ingredients for lasting improvement. The first is you need to have an effective innovation, something that has some evidence that it's effective, at least for certain populations. Next, you need effective implementation of those innovations. And third, you need an enabling context, that is an environment where that is hospitable to the change. If you have all 3 of those, you can expect socially significant outcomes. If you are missing any one of them, if you have a 0 in any part of that equation, your equal is going to be 0. So if you don't have an effective innovation, but you have effective implementation, you're not going to get those socially significant outcomes because you're starting with something that doesn't work. If you have an effective innovation, but you don't implement it effectively, you are not going to achieve those socially significant outcomes. And this is where a lot of, this is what implementation science and other disciplines really focus on, that many places don't have effective implementation strategies to implement those great practices. And then if you have effective innovation, effective implementation, but you're operating in an environment that is hostile, not compatible, you're not going to achieve those socially significant outcomes. So the goal is to, have all 3 of those, and then you will reach those socially significant outcomes, such as doubling the rate of, or at least, dramatically improving the rate of STEM graduation. So I want to start with effective innovations. There are 2 main features of an effective intervention or innovation. The first is that they do have some evidence of efficacy through research, or at least promise through research, and at least for certain populations. So there's some demonstration that these work. The second is that they are usable. And this, again, is where a lot of interventions don't have what it takes to be an effective intervention because they're not usable. And I'm going to go into that some more. If you look on the right side of the screen, this comes from NERN, and I've put the links, we'll be sending out the slides later, so you'll have the links to lots and lots of materials. So a usable intervention is something where it's clearly described. So it's really clear on what is it, how does it work, and why does it work? Why do we believe? What's the literature base or the theory behind why we think this is going to improve the outcomes we're trying to change? You also need to have the essential functions of the intervention clearly articulated. So what are those core components of the intervention that are required to reach your outcomes? So there might be pieces, if you implement something in different settings, there might be pieces that are not essential. There could be variation on certain things, but what are those core components that are really required to reach the outcomes? And those have to be really well specified so people know what they are. And then you need operational definitions of those core functions. And by that, I mean, the people who are implementing it need to know how to put those core components into practice. How do I change my behavior? What do I do to implement the practice so that it's really clear? And finally, you need to be able to assess performance so that you know, is the practice being implemented or not? And on the left side, all of this means that a usable intervention is teachable, learnable, doable, and readily accessible. And to be able to do all this, you've got to have stuff written down. Or, you've got to provide information either through documents or visual formats to communicate all this information. So I wanted to stop there. I don't know very much about your summer research immersion. I mean, I've heard some, but I just wanted a few people to unmute if you are muted and just share, what would you say are the core essential functions of the summer research experience? So, you're trying to, increase STEM persistence and interest and, eventual graduation. But tell me, what is it about the summer research immersion that is essential to achieve that outcome?
This is Mike Norton. I think for some of us, them forming a community is essential, and the research is not the biggest component of some summer programs.
Okay, so a core component is having an opportunity to make connections and build community.
Yes.
Okay.
There are a couple of items from the chat also.
Okay.
STEM near-peer mentors and participation in a real research experience.
Mm-hmm.
Access to professors in a non-professional setting, separate from coursework, and more one-on-one interaction with researchers. And Joanna has a question: can we reflect on the degree to which summer immersion programs are teachable, learnable, doable, and readily?
We are going to do that at the end. So yes, I have some questions to pose at the end, and we can certainly go to that. So I think that's a great idea. Okay, those are exactly the kinds of things that I would have thought that would be important core components. So if a university is it decides, hey, we're going to do this, you could tell them, hey, here are the 5 or 4 core things that we think this program needs to include. Okay, I'm going to move on. I wanted to give you an example of the approach to a usable intervention from healthcare. You may be familiar with this book, The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. He's also the author of Being Mortal, and both of these books were big sellers. I love this book. He just speaks my language. Atul Gawande is a physician, and he has been very concerned about hospital settings where doctors and medical providers make mistakes that cost lives and cause harm to people. And so he was on various national task force to try to really improve how healthcare happens. And so this book goes into, it starts by talking about dealing with complexity in hospital situations. There's just so many factors that people need to be considering as they're providing healthcare. And he is focused on reducing avoidable mistakes. So, we know what the right procedures are, but people make mistakes. And how do we reduce those and save lives? And he proposes doing that through operationalizing procedures through checklists. And these checklists have those core components on them. And he recommends keep it simple. Reducing the risk of infection, for example, in operations, that's just one thing that people do. And so you've got to have checklists that are simple, but have those core components. So he advocates checklists to improve practice, and he provides many examples where this really does work. So I love checklists, and checklists are a great way, one great way to make an intervention usable, because it explicitly says what needs to be done. And it can be backed up, with other resources. Next, I want to move to that middle box, and that is effective. I'm sorry, I was looking at the clock, just checking my time. Okay, effective implementation of those usable and effective innovations. These 4 buckets come from NERN, and I'm really going to mostly talk about the first 2. And the first one is what NERN calls implementation drivers. And I just need to mention that they use the term drivers differently than what you all have been using in improvement science. And I'm going to explain that difference so we're not confused. But we're going to talk about implementation drivers. We're going to talk about implementation teams. And I'm not going to talk very much about continuous feedback loops and stages of implementation, which you're already pretty familiar with because of the work you've already done. And we have limited time today, so I had to prioritize. Implementation drivers. I'm going to read this definition, and then I'll tell you how it differs from the drivers that you've been working with. Implementation drivers are the key components of capacity and infrastructure that influence a program's success. They are the core components needed to initiate and support change at different systems levels. So here they're talking about the capacity, how you build capacity. When you all did or many of you did the driver diagrams, in improvement science, drivers are the changes. So immersive experiences is a change that you want to make, and we call that a primary driver. So I'm not going to get into what you've done already, but just to point out that they use this term differently. And they talk about, NERN talks about 3 types of implementation drivers that are critical. One is competency, the second is organizational, and the third is leadership. And I'm going to go a little bit more into those. So the first one, competency, is paying attention to building the competencies of the individual implementers, the people who are running the summer research experience. And so that can be accomplished by some training or some coaching. And it doesn't have to be formal training, but it at least has to be the provision of some information. So maybe you would have an orientation meeting, something pretty simple in your case, and there'd be resource materials. But the people implementing need to know, again, what is this? How do we do it? And what are those core components? So some level of training needs to happen so that people have the knowledge and skills that they need to implement the program. You might really think about this in the faculty-student engagement. Erica, I forget the name of the organization, but you're bringing in the trainers to, how do you be a good mentor?
The possibility of life-bound coaching.
Yeah, so that would be, if you proceed with that would be a great example of, how is it that you are a good mentor? And there might be people who don't naturally have those skills, and you would need to build up the skills on how to be a good mentor. And maybe that would involve some training, and maybe it would involve some follow-up coaching and some practice. So that kind of intervention where people might need some new skills might really require more training and coaching. What I really want to emphasize today, and what you all could really start working on, is building capacity at the organizational level in the individual institutions that you're all in as you implement these various first 2 initiatives. And there are a couple things that are important there. One is facilitative administration. So not only do you need competent individuals implementing change, but you need people who have their back, who are making sure that that environment is hospitable. So these are people who would be figuring out or at least helping you address what are some of the internal barriers to implementing a program. That might be around scheduling, it could be around resources, staffing, policies, and paying attention to those, obtaining external resources, and using data to continually improve how hospitable the environment for change is. I was going to say something, but now I forgot. Well, what you're doing is, so like you're approaching summer, hopefully coronavirus won't be a thing and you actually can do this. So let's say you're proceeding, you're planning for this summer, you're building that facilitative administration now, but you're also building it toward the future. So you're thinking about, okay, here are some short-term things we're going to do. We may not have the resources right now, but we are continually looking at how do we continue to build the hospitable environment so that in the future, everything's in place and these programs operate without a hitch, or at least, relatively smoothly. And then a second part at the organizational level is from the organization reaching out to figure out system support. So some of the research on sustainable interventions, a lot of the research suggests that if you are an individual organization and you're just self-contained and you're running a program, you are less likely to be successful in the long term than organizations that are tied to some external system and that leverage external systems. So if you're a university, of course, you would want to leverage the First Two network, but also, state agencies, the includes, maybe professional development organizations, you all are very well connected, and so you have some of those external system support available, but really making sure that at the institution level, you're accessing those so that you're building the capacity of your individual institutions. I don't know if I said that really clearly, but we can talk about that. I'll move on to leadership, and then I'll stop and check to see if we have anything in the chat or questions. Building leadership capacities. You may know the literature over decades and decades clearly show that having leaders at all levels of your systems who understand what you're trying to do, who advocate for it, who are there providing those resources, that is critical to long-term sustainability. And you have some great people, but you really need to be thinking about that within your institutions. How can we get our high-level administrators, really invested in what we're trying to do? And you have done work with with your state policymakers. So again, there you want to find those champions at different levels of the system, and I'm sure you know this already, but I'm just telling you that the research is really clear on how critical this is for long-term sustainability. So I'll stop there to see if there's anything in the chat or any questions or comments. So we're good. Okay, we will have time at the end to dive into all of this. So I definitely plan time for discussion. The purpose of these implementation drivers. So you have your drivers, you're building competency of individuals, you're building organizational capacity, you're building leadership capacity. Your goal is for that middle box so that these practices, these innovations, these programs are consistently and in a sustainable way used. So you want consistent, sustained use of the innovation with fidelity. And with fidelity means you're using those core components that have been shown to be effective. So the intervention has integrity. and that people are using it that way. And that's why it's so important to have that performance assessment to monitor if the practices are being implemented using those core essential functions. And if you have consistent, sustained use of those effective innovations, you should see socially significant outcomes. I'm going to move to implementation teams. The top part here shows that there are various approaches to change. So there is Let It Happen, and that is, we have this great summer research immersion program, and you all should do it. It's a great program. Good luck. Here's what it is. Good luck. That's Let It Happen. Help It Happen would be, hey, we have this great summer research immersion program. We're going to give you some resources to help you implement it. The resources, tell you, all about it, what to do and all that. Good luck. The third part of this is making it happen. And this is where implementation teams come in. And it says here, implementation teams help make it happen. They provide an internal support structure to move selected programs and innovations through the stages of implementation. If you want sustained implementation of your initiatives for lasting impact, you really need to be in the make it happen category. And make it happen isn't authoritarian. It's not saying you must do it. It's how do we provide the infrastructure that is going to, first of all, motivate people to do it and enable them to do it successfully. So that's what make it happen means. And so the role of implementation teams are to increase buy-in and involvement of various stakeholders, to make sure that the needed resources and supports are in place, to monitor implementation, to help problem solve when problems come up, which they will, as you know, and to be paying attention to capacity for sustainability, to just be continually thinking about how do we build capacity so that in a year, 2 years, 5 years, these practices are going to be sustained. Really, the implementation teams are responsible. It's an accountability. They have the responsibility for implementing a particular intervention, or maybe it's a group of interventions. So you could have an implementation team that is about summer research immersions. You also want to think about having implementation teams at different systems levels. You already have implementation teams at the first 2 network level. So you have working groups, you have committees. Now you're all working on a lot of different initiatives, but maybe a subgroup is working on particular interventions. You also want implementation teams at the institutions. And so the implementation teams at the network level are going to have a different role than the implementation teams at the institutional levels, but you really need both to move toward lasting change and to support implementation as it's happening. I'm going to pause there. Anything coming up in the chat?
Well, I just posted something in the chat, and that'll give other people time to think. Were you saying that the working groups that we already have, like maybe the immersive experiences working group, is at some level an implementation team, or could be? Because it doesn't seem like they're doing what these things are.
No, I think I would argue that they are doing some of these. Maybe they could do more, but you have this, let me put it this way, you have the structure. I suspect that you are doing things to support implementation at the different sites that are implementing the summer research immersions. And implementation, to take that to the next level is you would be really saying, okay, we're At the first two network level, we are taking responsibility for supporting implementation of the summer research immersions at the institutions. What does that look like? What kind of communication do we need to have? What kind of resources do we need to provide them? How do we continually check in to make sure everything's going okay? And then you would also have implementation teams at those institutions, because they're the ones figuring out, how is this going to work in our environment? Who do we need to involve? What staffing might we try to advocate for over time to institutionalize this program? And those two teams would be working very closely with each other. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that helps a lot. And then Hannah wrote, would institutional implementation teams have students and faculty?
Sure, absolutely. Community members, industry, it could be anyone who has a perspective on improving implementation. And implementation teams, the way I think of it is, it's an implementation team for a specific program. Now, you have multiple initiatives. You've got, other things going on. You might have teams that overlap, but really you need, if you want a high quality implementation of the summer research immersion, you need to identify people that's going to be their job. They're responsible for making sure implementation happens, that the people implementing are supported, and that you're assessing how it's going. Okay. I'm not going to talk much about enabling context. A lot of what you're doing in effective implementation is creating those enabling contexts. So to make sure that the resources, the infrastructure is in place, the leadership's in place, and all that. You might have institutions, in fact, where you just decide, they're just not set up for this kind of initiative. And so you might decide from the beginning, we're not even going to try there because for whatever reasons, it's not a good place for this kind of intervention. So that's all I'm going to say about enabling context. I am almost done, so we're going to have lots of time for discussion. I'm bringing you back to these 4 buckets of effective implementation. We talked about those drivers, and that was the competency, organizational, and leadership. We talked a little bit about implementation teams, and I'm just going to talk very briefly about the last 2, continuous feedback and stages of implementation, by showing you this figure, which many of you have seen before. You can use PDSA cycles at different levels of implementation. And as you go through different levels, you are constantly thinking about sustainability and preparing for sustainability as you go along. So where you are, my understanding of where you are with summer research immersions are, you did some small scale tests, you implemented it very narrowly. I forget, Erica, maybe it was just one site, or I forget how you started, but it was very small in scale. This summer you have expanded and have multiple sites, and so you're probably in that next level where you are fine tuning. And you can do PDSA cycles on how is it going. So not just before, I think you've been doing PDSA cycles on, is this working in terms of what the practice is. But as you go forward, you're paying a lot more attention to, how is it being implemented? How can we improve implementation of the practice? And you can use PDSA cycles to be constantly improving that. And hopefully you get to that last larger wheel where you are ready to implement at scale. You have all the resources that are needed. You've identified all the supports, you've expanded, and hopefully that will result in the improvements that you are seeking. Okay, so now it's time to, if you're willing to participate, to unmute or talk in the chat. So Joanna's question. So I have different categories, but we'll start with this since Joanna said, asked. So let's start with usable intervention. To what extent is the summer research immersion program a usable intervention? And then here, what actions could we take to make sure it is teachable, learnable, doable, and accessible? So you tell me, how would you answer these questions?
Are you tossing the ball to me, Debbie? This is Joanna.
Not necessarily.
Okay, because I definitely I'm more curious about what the kind of site leaders would say to those questions. I just loved your framing of this, and it was helping me zoom out a little bit. Sorry, I quit my video because I'm buffering with my internet here.
Okay. No, I was not pointing to Joanna. I'm asking any of you, do you think that to what extent is the summer research immersion program a usable intervention? That is it teachable, learnable, doable, and accessible? So what do you think?
You might
So Mike,
start with your core essential functions that are listed, and you could take one, for example. I mean, COI kind of did this without documenting it in real time, but last year they recognized that they needed some structured free time and that should be an essential function, and they added it, and they didn't officially measure it, but they saw an improvement. So you could make things like that more structured as a PDSA type of thing.
Do you have those core components written?
We have them in the chat, and then, we have them probably in some of our recipe documents that live on the drive, but I think that would be a really useful thing to list those and rank those and then start to test them.
And then maybe to the site leaders, what do you need from the network or from people who have done this before? If you're doing it for the first time, what do you need to make sure that this program is it is learnable to you who are administering it, that it's doable, that it's really clear on what needs to happen, and that it's accessible, that you can figure out, or if you're doing it the way that was intended?
so to put a little bit of direct point on that would be Aida, Chris, Mark, and Sanish in particular, since you guys are new sites.
So, sorry, this is Aida Jimenez. As a first-time site leader, I feel like I have gotten a lot of ideas from the network on things that have worked well. So I feel like this is definitely on its way. I think if we could just, if there was one document that listed this, just as you presented it today, it makes a lot more sense.
And so how did you get information about it?
So, well, the request for proposal, for example, had an example of what had been done at another site that was successful, and that was very useful because what I was able to see was the report that the site produced, not necessarily the proposal itself that they wrote. At least I guess that's what I focused on in particular. So having seen a report that sort of went over, this is what we said we were going to do, and this is how we assess it at the end, included a lot of that information that helped me put our proposal together. But I think maybe making it a lot more, I don't know, I guess I'm missing my words here, but more specific, more sort of a standard operating procedure sort of manual. That's kind of hard to do though, because you're asking people to also be original, but
Absolutely. Yeah, right. And the whole idea of articulating core components is to communicate what are the core things that are really, required for, we think, for reaching the outcomes. But then what are the variables? There's a lot of different ways, I'm sure, to run these, and your institutions are all different. You have different people, you have different student populations. So it's not to say that everyone has to do it uniformly, but people need to understand what are those core features that are really essential, and then everything else, might be suggestions. Here's how we did it.
So that from that report that I read, there were a lot of those elements that were pretty obvious there, but I don't think they were pointed as core elements, right? There were things that were obviously jumping off the page that this has to have, but they weren't necessarily outlined as that.
All right, so one possibility is some revisions of some of the materials that are given to make it more clear. What are those essential functions? I'm wondering, maybe from someone else or anyone, do you have, when people are operating at a site, the summer research immersion, is there a written description on what it is, why you're doing it, and why you think this is going to, what you're hoping to achieve and why you think this would work? Is there anything written that people, so then that's under the clear description. Is there something written that people really understand the background for why we're doing this, why we think this is going to improve persistence and graduation? So is that written?
Speaking for WVSOM, I would say no, we do not have anything like that at this point. That might be something that would be easier for us to pursue. However, maybe at the end, looking retrospectively, that would be something that we could put together a little bit easier, I think, at that point.
And I think that's something that that was probably a first to network responsibility, using the experience of the different sites, but that clear description, well, it could be two levels. One level is, here's a summer research experience, here's why institutions would do it, here's what we're trying to achieve. Then you might also have an institutional level one where it's tweaked a little bit. But when you talk about summer research immersions, I think as a network, you want some materials together that are your best thinking about, based on your experiences on why, what is this? Why is it important to do? What are you trying to achieve? And, a little bit, maybe, a couple sentences about the research base, why we think, what's the evidence that we think this is going to work? This is going to motivate people to implement it well when they understand. And you all talk, so I'm not saying, you don't already have this, but I'm just trying to help you think of really institutionalizing these. So when you do come to maybe a new partner or, a new department that hasn't been involved, they've got something written that is just really clear that people can go, oh, yeah, I get it. Oh, this is really important. I want to be a part of this because I want to achieve those outcomes. So any other comments on usable intervention?
So Debbie, there are a few things in the comments. Mike said getting the student comments about how the program helped last year's participants could be the most useful. Jack suggested that, with the coronavirus, things like wash your hands, stay 6 feet away, like an operational list, checklist. A couple people said checklists. And Mike also said visiting a site that was in play last summer and being able to ask questions of the participants and mentors was very helpful.
Great.
Sanish or
yeah,
go ahead.
this is Sanish, WBTech. One of the things that I'm looking for is the schedule, actually. That is one of my strongest resource that I'm looking to just follow that. So a review by as a together or among some excellent review of the schedule would actually also help me to think like this thing maybe it's not helping, you need to modify it, this part, something like that. That might be helpful as well.
I'm sorry, there was background noise and I didn't hear everything.
Are you asking for a schedule, a sample schedule, or several sample schedules to sort of be able to base yours on, Sanish?
No, we already have the schedule, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, like review of the schedule together to see like some of the things that might be needed or which might not be helpful. And then those might be actually helpful to the site, I think, in my opinion.
So a review of the schedules that the different sites have planned so far.
Yes, or at least in my case. So some of the things might be kind of useful, but some of them might not be useful. In those cases, you might want to replace those by more effective events.
So it sounds like what you're talking about is shared learnings and shared discussions for people to help understand, what works best, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yep, I agree. Okay, I'm paying attention to time. So the next category of things we could possibly discuss are just starting to think about those implementation drivers. So the first one, competency, what training and or information do those implementing the summer immersive experiences need to have to be successful? We've kind of just been talking about that. Opportunities to interact with others that are implementing or who have. We talked about making sure that there's documentation that has the information. Do you see, is there a need for any training? I don't know who all is involved in running these, but I imagine there's probably some informal training or informal passing on of information.
There's definitely mentor training, but I think it's just this peer information sharing that we're doing for the leaders of the different sites.
And for something like this program, that's probably sufficient because, I don't know, this is a more straightforward, I don't know. I'm just comparing it to other types of interventions where real people wouldn't naturally have the skills and knowledge that they would need and would really need more intensive training. So that makes sense to me that you're giving information on how things work. Okay, organizational. How could we build a facilitative administration at each institution to support implementation? What could this look like for 2020? And then the next question is, what would this look like if summer immersive experiences became a part of regular business practices? Like, what kind of supports would need to be in place? So just a little bit of brainstorming from you all on what is needed at an institution if you are trying to build something that is going to sustain. What would be some supports that you would need to run this program?
Kind of common at all institutions that they're very much behind this, just as long as it has zero cost. And that's a hard thing to get over for me.
Yep.
Yeah, I think in the long run, that's not going to be sustainable. I mean, I don't know what you guys think.
It seems to me like there are some intermediate steps, and in order to convince, an institution, a higher education institution that is strapped for resources, or the legislature to fund things like this, we need our own evidence in addition to what the literature says. We need our own evidence that this was a valuable thing, that it keeps the students in those majors and keeps them in the institutions and is therefore financially a good idea, as well as having the desired impact that we want it to have.
Absolutely. I think that would be very motivating to high-level administrators.
I think it would also be worth considering that we could, instead of us trying to figure out what they would want to be able to see, is to just convene a group of the people that make those decisions in the institutions that we're already working with and ask them, what would they need to see to make this be an investment?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm going to just move us down because I promised 60 minutes. And I think I have like 5 minutes left. And I know there's lots of other pressing topics to discuss. So I'm going to move us along. And so this is just thinking about using PDSA cycles and feedback loops. So feedback loops just meaning something more informal or something that's not technically a PDSA cycle. But do you have ideas on using PDSA cycles or feedback loops to improve implementation of the summer research immersions? Like, do you have that built in now? I know you had PDSA cycles leading up to this, but as you go forward, are you thinking about how to collect information that's going to tell you how it's going and how you can improve?
I think that is on our major to-do list for this meeting we're supposed to be having at the end of this month, to really look at those changes that we can make to the implementation that can be measured while we're doing it, and then modified for some PDSA, so that within the 2 weeks, we choose small, measurable goals to the implementation that we could do PDSAs on while we're doing these.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets to a more uniform, or that helps us really decide whether these hypothesized major components are really the ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great way to, to figure out what are the core components and what are not core. You know, what can vary. Any other thoughts?
I'll just say that from a sort of leadership perspective, the idea that I so much appreciate all you site leaders who have signed in, who don't normally attend these meetings. And even while this may seem like, oh, blah, 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 this is actually the heart. Debbie, that's not against your talk. That's an amazing presentation. But I understand that if you want to run a summer immersive, you might be thinking, okay, but how do I recruit? How do I blah? I got to do these logistics things. This stuff is actually why NSF is funding us. So it's this change and the scaling of the change and the institutionalizing of the change that's really what we have to do. And so it's where we're trying to put resources and incentivizing for you guys to participate in this and take it on. I hope I said that okay.
Well, and it's both. It's how to, this summer, these people who have never done it before, what are the, the logistics? How do we do this? But at the same time, paying attention to, and how do we build this, build sustainability for the future? And you have to be doing both at the same time for sustainability. Which
means this data collection and this plan, do, study, act, the improvement science angles of it have to be baked in. They're not like optional.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to skip implementation teams. We talked about it a little bit, just to go to just some overall thoughts. What struck you? What excited you? Or what didn't excite you? Or just what, is there something that doesn't feel relevant? So maybe start with, well, I don't know. It's open for comments to round out our discussion on sustainability.